everyone. This video is the start of our discussion of masculinity theory. And I'm starting with an overview of concepts of masculinity and in particular historical concepts of masculinity. If you remember in our introductory weeks, we looked at how there were various theories of what gender actually is. And we talked about how key theorists saw gender as something separate from sex in both sociological and feminist thought. We looked at West and Zimmerman, who talked about several layers of gender and sexuality and sex and sexuality. And they talked about sex being something based on biological markers, having a certain conformation of genitalia as an adult, having certain secondary sexual characteristics of the body. They then talked about a second layer, sex categorization, which is where society imposes certain normative expectations on people based upon the conformation of their sexed body. That is, where a person is assigned male at birth, for example, they're expected to enact certain behaviours, to fit within certain normative binary categories of male and female, and then to adopt certain gender performance. Gender was that final level that they looked at. And gender is, for the individual, the activity of managing situated conduct in light of normative conceptions of attitudes and activities appropriate for a sex category. So, one's gender is a performative, though often unconsciously performative, adoption of behaviours and characteristics which are seen as normative for the categorization which is imposed on one because of one's sexed body. Judith Butler talks about gender as a performative act. She doesn't mean it's completely chosen, as we discussed when we looked at feminism. What she meant was that we all, throughout our life, constitute our own gender by conforming with social expectations or resisting them or replicating them and creating ideas of gender in the way that we present in the world. For example, me in this video wearing a colourful dress rather than a men's coded suit. And all of that behaviour is something that we can see as performative, even though it may not be consciously or voluntarily chosen. Butler, West and Zimmerman and others also talk about how very strong these systems are in societies and the very strong disciplinary behaviours of others that force gender upon people so that many people don't feel that they have a choice, and many acts of gender performance are completely unconscious because of adoption of normative roles. As we mentioned, also theorists such as Wittig, Guillermin and others talk about the fact that even the categories, our binary sex categories, our binary gendered categories, which are separate again from our sex categories of men and women, are socially created. And this idea, this concept of gender as a role imposed upon people and then normatively performed by those people is something that we'll look at a little bit further as we move into the ideas of masculinity studies. Historically, masculinity, like femininity, had various ideas that were relatively rigid around gender role. Men also were subject to the separate spheres philosophy that I talked about somewhat in early days for women, and that were something that early feminists often challenged. For men, their sphere was one of public activity, excluded from many types of familial role, in that they were often not the primary carers for children. They often had power and responsibility over the home, but very little hands-on activity within the home in the same way that women had. In the 1960s and 70s, And earlier throughout the 20th century, many theorists of sociology talked about sex roles as something which was complementary, that there were definitive roles for people gendered female and gendered male, that they were complementary, that they were biologically determined. We have problematized those in feminism and in queer theory. If you're watching this first, they all tie together. But that was something very much seen as a predetermined, complementary role, each of which bounded the role of the other gender and which didn't blur. So there was women's roles as nurturing, some refer to it as expressive. Men's roles were outside of the house, often with more access to power, income, etc., and often also described as instrumentive, that is based in action rather than feelings. And that each of these roles was biologically determined and not able to be taken on by the other gender. Those sex roles where people stepped outside of them, it was seen to be transgressive or abnormal when they stepped outside of normative expectation for their gender roles. Of course, feminism challenged this. Rather than saying women must stay in the house, men go out to work, white feminism challenged that idea and said that women should be in the workplace as for men, ignoring, of course, the fact that for many people of colour and many working class women, that had never been a reality. But they did start to say, well, these roles can be broken down. Women can do the activities which were previously reserved for men. So where did that leave men and masculinity? It also started to be reconsidered. And this led to what today we would call masculinity studies. And a key text in the start of masculinity studies is Carrigan, Connell and Lee's Towards a New Sociology of Masculinity. They start for much of the article by reviewing and critiquing older research, particularly what they call sex role research, and also what they call books about men. They look at the idea that even those who would problematize masculinity still seem to see an essentialist and normative idea that there were still roles for men and women, whether socially ordained or biologically ordained, and that there was just this role which people then either complied with or refused. The role itself was seen as a social artefact or a biological artefact which merely existed. The Carrigan, Connell and Lee, however, go further into the idea and borrowing from both feminism and gay liberation writers, they consider the idea that those roles themselves are completely socially created. And they looked at the idea then of the rise of books about men and masculinity and talk about how those sex roles and are also aspects of power relations created by interrelationships between genders and often as expressions of power, particularly by those who benefit from the patriarchy, often men, against those who do not. They went further and they looked at the idea that feminism was challenging the idea of a normative neutral masculinity and femininity. And they also looked at the ideas of gay liberation writers. As you can see, this article was written in 1985. So the feminism of the 1970s was very new. And the ideas of gay liberation themselves and queer theory were relatively newcomers on the block of critical theory. And gay liberation was something which was very much coming out of the late 60s and early 70s and looking at breaking down a range of social stories about what sexuality and non-heterosexual sexuality meant. And so Carrigan, Connell and Lee looked at the idea of multiple masculinities and identified what they call hegemonic masculinity. The same term's been used by a lot of writers about masculinity and is now a key plank of masculinity studies. Hegemonic masculinity is the masculinity which is most normative but also most reinforced within society. It is in many ways an aspirational masculinity. Not many men do not fully achieve the status of perfect hegemonic masculine person. And Carrigan, Connell and Lee look at the way that hegemonic masculinity in particular is defined not only in relation to femininity as something which is separate and which defines boundaries of men away from femininity, but also as a practice which subordinates groups of men, such as men who were not heterosexual. They see it as the creation of hegemonic masculinity as something which is used to reinforce patriarchal power relations through the heterosexual family, usually with a mother and father and children, and as something which defines itself in distinction to femininity and non-hegemonic masculinities. So they describe the fact that there can be both hegemonic masculinity, that is, the masculinity which enacts and behaves as the idealised masculinity within a group, and subordinated masculinities, the masculinities of gay men, the masculinities of effeminate men or younger men, those who are not part of hegemonic groups. They also trace the fact that in many ways this was a relatively recent, the way this is constructed in our current society is a relatively recent idea, that there had always been hegemonic masculinities, but these can change from time to time. So with the rise in the late Victorian period of changes to women's roles in an increasingly industrialised society, they chronicle a rise of a definition of homosexuality which had not previously existed and which serves as a distinction and reinforcement of hegemonic heterosexual masculinity. The idealised masculinity which reinforced the power of men over both women and men who departed from certain types of masculinised standards. Since then, there have been a whole range of studies of masculinity which take this idea, their new sociology of masculinity, and have come to be what we now call masculinity studies, which is something I'm going to deal with more in the next few videos. This is especially so since 1995 with later works by Connell and others. There have, however, been several streams of approaches to studying or discussing masculinity in society. Generally speaking, there are two overall arching differences. One group is draws from feminist thinking and is concerned to break down power structures which oppress and disadvantage others. And one is more about reinforcing power structures or returning to certain ideologies of masculinity. Even as early as the 1985 Carrigan, Connell and Lee paper, men's studies as a general category had started to move away from the acknowledgement of oppressive power structures based on gendered roles and into the idea that, to some degree is true of course, patriarchy hurts everyone, but that men were equally disadvantaged across the board, including heterosexual, white, middle-class men, as opposed to those who had historically studied their oppression, such as women, people of colour and queer people. The men's studies movement tended to co-opt the language of oppression and to seek a way out of oppression for men, sometimes through reinvigorating masculinity, such as the Iron John movement in the late 1970s and 1980s. Men's rights groups, as a political movement, have also become part of this. There are, of course, serious issues with the constructions of masculinity which do lead to deleterious outcomes for men. However, what is often bundled under the badge of men's rights or men's rights activist groups today are often specifically anti-feminist groups who exist to undo gains of feminism and sometimes to attack feminists more specifically than working towards the aims they often claim, which are to reduce disadvantages to men in society. Some of you may be aware of the so-called incel movement and other outgrowths of the men's rights movement, which are particularly vitriolic against women who step outside of the role of sexual object. And so some of those issues have been warped towards specifically anti-feminist agendas. Not all, of course. There are some men's rights groups who genuinely care and genuinely work to assist men in society. However, there are many who use that badge in a different way. At an academic level, there's men's studies groups which tend to be sometimes anti-feminist or sometimes downplay the role of patriarchy. However, there are other groups such as critical theorists, including masculinity theorists, who include the study of power and oppression within their study of masculinities, who look at how the concepts of hegemonic masculinity harm men, but also how they replicate power structures and serve to reinforce power structures in a way which, while not advantaging most men or all men, will advantage some or many men, and which therefore are replicated as part of certain types of power structuring in society. There are also pro-feminist men's studies groups who also study the idea of men's role in society, not necessarily through a masculinity studies idea, but through what Carrigan, Connell and Lee talked about as men's liberation groups. Men becoming aware of power structures in society, including gendered power structures, and unpacking those and considering along lines of gender, class, sexuality, etc., how those play out in the lives of men. So generally speaking, what we'll be looking at mostly in this course are masculinity theories and a little bit of men's studies theory, unpacking, however, gender relationships of power and oppression. I tend not to be someone who ignores the role of feminism in men's lives or the role of oppressions of women and people who are not cis-het men in power structures. So I tend not to draw from men's studies theorists who downplay or disregard those outcomes. So that's basically what we're doing, studying men and masculinity, looking particularly at masculinity theories, and the later videos this week will go into more details with those. I'll also be presenting videos from a range of masculinity theorists talking about their perceptions of masculinity and replications of masculinity in society. So that's it for this video. Please work through the others for this week, and don't forget that all of the modules on feminism, queer theory, intersectionality, and this module do have overlapping discussions and issues within them around the gendering of power and law. So that's it for this video.